Hello, and welcome to USEA's Energy Stakeholder podcast. I'm Will Polen, Senior Director at the United States Energy Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with USEA, we are a nonprofit membership association headquartered in Washington, D.C. Our objective is to promote the best use of energy for the greatest use of humankind. We are not a typical association. We're a voluntary membership association that places a great emphasis on energy education. We have two purposes in life. One is to serve as a forum for the U.S. energy industry and a convening power for the industry. And the second is to cooperate with our colleagues in the U.S. government where USEA's member interests and the government's commercial and geopolitical interests coincide. Pleased to be joined here today by Dan Ludwig, Senior Vice President for New Nuclear Services at Excel Services Corporation. We're going to be discussing small modular reactor technology and its application internationally. Dan, it's really a pleasure to have you here. I wish you would take a moment to introduce Excel Services. It's been a long-time member of USEA. We're very proud to have you, and your CEO is a member of our board of directors. I wish you'd take a moment to introduce us to Excel and talk about your journey, how you got to Excel and what you do there.
Thanks, Will. It's a pleasure to be here today and to speak with you about small modular reactors. So Dan Ludwig, I'm the Senior Vice President of New Nuclear Services for Excel Services Corporation. Excel is a leading supplier of nuclear services to the operating nuclear plants in the United States, as well as new nuclear plants in the US and across the world. We really specialize in regulatory and legal aspects of new nuclear plants, but support the entire ecosystem of nuclear deployments. We're based in Rockville, Maryland, and have operated in projects in 34 countries across the world. We've been around for 40 years. We've worked with every nuclear plant in the United States, and currently we have around 250 on staff supporting our projects. My own background is I've worked for large utilities in the United States. I've worked for advanced nuclear suppliers, and I've been now with Excel for almost a year working on supporting new nuclear projects across the world.
Dan, thanks again for joining us here at USEA. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about small modular reactors, which have been in the news for several years and are gaining interest with the increase in load driven by data centers, onshoring of manufacturing, and electrification. For those of our listeners who are unfamiliar with small modular reactors, could you give us a little bit of a description of them and why they're different than the traditional nuclear reactors our listeners may be familiar with?
So the nuclear reactors that have been built across the world, starting in the 1950s through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, were largely what we call large nuclear power plants. These power plants range anywhere from 500 to 1,000 to 1,200 megawatts of electrical output per reactor. And the idea generally with those projects was thinking economies of scale. The bigger you build the thing, the cheaper it is on a per megawatt hour basis to run it. There are a lot of economic ideas of sharing resources and multiple units on a single site, these very large units. In recent years, we've seen very large nuclear plants be built, but the cost and schedule overruns have been dramatic. And really, this comes down to if you look at mega projects in general, if it's a large bridge or a large building, it's very hard to project manage these just massive projects. So, a potential solution to that cost and schedule challenges is looking at what they're called small modular reactors, SMRs. And then there's an extreme case where they call them micro modular reactors, even smaller yet. The idea with a small modular reactor, instead of looking at building a very large thing to get an economy of scale, you build many of a smaller thing. Uh, when you think of, to draw an analogy, if you look at a solar farm, you don't see one giant solar panel. You see many small solar panels that were built in a factory, shipped in a standard truck to a site, and easy to assemble one at a time. So that's the same thing that small modular reactors are doing. So what small means is typically you're talking about a 50 to about 300 megawatt electric per unit. Reactors that have components that can be shipped on standard shipping means you don't have to have the largest truck in the world move components. You can have things that are mass produced in factories. You can have modular assembly where things are pre-manufactured at a factory. So when they get on site, you're just doing assembly instead of actual stick building a power plant. So all of these reasons are driving towards SMRs as potentially the next wave of technologies to be built. These, and along with all of the value of reducing the cost to build and reduce the potential for overrunning the cost of the project and the schedule and all of those costs. Small modular reactors also have the opportunity to do multiple units on a site. In that, if your load is growing over time and your grid is going to need to grow over time to accept the load, you can build one unit now, a next unit in a couple of years, next unit in a couple of years. As compared to building 1,000 megawatt plant, your grid may not be ready for 1,000 megawatts, and you may not need that much power right now. So by building these smaller plants, you can get power online faster that matches the load you need. So that's just a brief overview of SMRs, Will.
Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful. And it really provides a nice segue to the conversation we want to have about applications for SMRs internationally. I've worked in the international power sector for many years, and one of the major problems in attracting new investment in power sectors internationally is just being able to accumulate enough capital. To me, that the SMR provides countries, whether they be in the advanced economies or in sort of the next tier of advanced developing economies, the opportunity to not have to build a very, very large nuclear reactor, but to build, as you suggest, a series of smaller reactors so that the capital accumulation challenges and the financing of the project be more easily handled at that level.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. And I will say, Excel, in our expertise in legal and regulatory matters, we do partner with other organizations that are experts in the financing. And so I'm going to do a quick shout out to one of my good friends, Paul Murphy, who helped me prepare for today's discussion on financing. But a couple of comments here on financing. You're right. With the smaller reactors, you can do smaller amounts of capital over time. You may end up needing the same amount of capital if you build a 1,000 megawatt plant and 1,000 megawatts of small modular reactors. It may even be more capital, but you're looking at a time deployment.
Dan, thanks for sharing that insight. I think that's a factor that not many people have considered. And as we begin to deploy these reactors overseas, it may provide a competitive advantage for this type of technology. But as you know, financing any project in overseas markets, whether it be a well-established technology like a combined cycle gas turbine, or this new first-of-a-kind plant that will be deployed in a country, SMRs, the financing for those it requires a multifaceted allocation and identification of risk. And one of the risks, which I think you all at Excel Services specialize in, is regulatory and overcoming the regulatory challenges. So many countries who are interested in SMRs don't yet have the full regulatory and institutional framework for a traditional nuclear power plant. And we are looking for them now to develop a regulatory capacity that will enable financing, security, nuclear safety, and the framework for financing that's necessary for licensing. We're asking them to do that on a technology that's new and hasn't yet been deployed. What's your experience of working with countries who are now entering this field and are facing this challenge of a new technology and developing the licensing regimes necessary to support it?
This is an area we work with a lot of countries on, which we call infrastructure development. And it's maybe not infrastructure when you think of roads and bridges and airports, but it's what's the infrastructure you need to have in place to be able to deploy nuclear power. And legal and regulatory is part of it, but we work with countries across the board. So there is one entity, it's called the NEPU, which is an IAEA term, which is essentially the entity in the government that is responsible for developing the nuclear power program. And this is kind of the first step a country needs to take, is have that NEPU identified and work through setting what is the division and the direction that the country is going to take. What are the partnerships they need to make? And then start talking about bringing external experts or starting to talk with those financial institutions. What does the stakeholder engagement roadmap look like? You need to get that early trust and support from the local people, from the local corporations, from the communities, from the other government agencies, all of those aspects. You need to have the workforce developed. The workforce development is going to be a major challenge, especially if you're in a country that has never had nuclear power before. Um, there's many countries that are looking at developing nuclear power by using expats to bring in from countries that have nuclear power, but there's only so many of those to go around. So developing the local
Mm.
expertise is really the best way to develop that. And then nuclear power, with the challenges that come with managing nuclear reactors, has to have a different way of thinking, a safety culture that goes above and beyond what many other industries have. And so even if you have a strong oil and gas industry, for example, with many of the similar technical minded people, there's a different way of thinking that nuclear power requires. So that NEPU is kind of step one to getting everything in place. Once the NEPU is up and running, then we start talking about, okay, what does your regulator look like? The regulator has to have several key concepts. It has to be independent, legally separated from the promotion of nuclear power, it has to just regulate it. They have to have clear standards. They have to have rigorous inspection protocols throughout the life cycle of the nuclear plant. They have to have technical expertise. Again, we're getting back to the workforce. They may not have that. They may have to rely on expats or some other external entity to help support them. And then a third entity that needs to be developed is the owner operator. Who's going to manage this plant? Who's going to run it? They have to have the right expertise again to comply with the regulator. They have to be able to manage the stakeholders. They have to be able to manage the cost, schedule, and safety of a very large construction project. And back to the idea of SMRs, maybe we can break out these mega projects into smaller construction projects and make it easier to manage. They have to be able to manage a vendor, select a vendor, and manage and provide oversight of the vendor. So really, those three key entities are part of that infrastructure. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has a milestone approach to developing nuclear plants, new nuclear programs. It's 19 milestones, but a lot of the milestones are covered by those three entities to ensure that they think through all of the different aspects that are required to build a new nuclear plant. And just one last thing I'll mention here is when looking at exporting nuclear technology from the United States, there is a special regulation. It's Part 810, CFR 10 CFR 810, that lists what you're allowed to export and which countries you're allowed to export. And so there's a list of some 20, 30 countries that the US has approved to export nuclear technology to. If the country isn't on that list, it makes things more challenging when working with a US reactor technology company. So those are some of the infrastructure things that need to be addressed from the very beginning before a country can start really considering the financial terms of building a new nuclear plant.
Thanks. That's very helpful. And I'm familiar with this term infrastructure. We as our in our work overseas had always called it soft infrastructure to distinguish it from the
Yeah.
infrastructure that we would typically think of. But you're right. It's the rules, it's the regulations, it's the contracts, it's the rule of law that needs to be in place for any project, and especially for an SMR project. So let me ask you and call an audible on here. What are some of the countries that you see are beginning to put these frameworks in place that would be first adopters of American SMR technology? And what have they done well that other countries might want to emulate?
I'll just call out two countries here recently that have been added to the DOE 810 Appendix A list of generally authorized countries, both Philippines and Singapore. have recently been added. Now, to get there, there's a couple of steps to get there first. There's the 123 agreement, which is a nuclear non-proliferation agreement they have to sign. There's definitely a bit of political politics that goes on here. That playing well in the sandbox with the U.S. government helps move that along. But now they're actively, and Philippines just passed a law I'll call it last summer, where they're now establishing their new nuclear regulator. And so they're walking down that process that they've kind of gone from that initial NEPU roadmap planning to, all right, here's our regulator. And they are now working with the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, USTDA, just released an RFP with for the benefit of their large utility, Meralco, that who will be the owner operator, presumably, of the new nuclear plants, to help Meralco go through the technology selection, start going through siting selection, and really those initial steps to build a new nuclear plant. So I'd say Philippines is one of the countries that's moving quickly. Um, Singapore, I said as well, they're working with they've been added to the DOE 10 list, and they're working on staffing up their expertise so that they can start evaluating new nuclear plants. Now, each of those countries has different challenges, technically, socially, regulatorily, but all things you can work through once you have that initial infrastructure and foundation in place.
That's great. I am particularly glad to hear that the Philippines is making progress. One of my first international assignments, and I won't tell you how long ago that was in the Philippines when we were seeking to enable independent power projects to be legal in the Philippines. And even at that time, they were talking about building a Westinghouse reactor. And this was I won't even tell you how many decades ago that was. So I'm glad to see that they're making progress. Um, you mentioned public acceptance, and I wonder in we understand how public acceptance has wavered and waned and then come back a little bit in the United States, recognizing the attributes the technology gives us with low carbon, firm capacity, and in response to the increasing demands for energy. How do you see that internationally, and what do countries do to build support for this technology in countries that maybe haven't had it before, maybe are skeptical, and they may have non-state or other state actors that are pushing back against American technology in their countries?
One aspect you listed off several key aspects of benefits of nuclear power. Carbon-free power generation, it's dispatchable power. It's on whether the sun shines or the wind blows. Nuclear power plants make power. One other key aspect is energy resilience. That is really a factor that's driving more and more entities to think about nuclear power. When you have a nuclear power plant, your power plant can run for call it 18 months to 2 years for existing reactors. And some advanced reactors are talking about running for 5 to 10 years without needing a new fuel load.
Mm.
And so, as compared to relying on liquefied natural gas that has to have a shipment coming every couple months, or diesel that needs to be constantly shipped in, or if you're talking about other perhaps coal or any other source of fuel that isn't local, you can really distance yourself from those supply chains by having resilient power supply, by having your own fuel. So that's one key aspect that is driving people to think about nuclear. As far as getting people on board with nuclear, a lot of people, I was just asked by my niece who's 17 years old, what happens if you bomb a nuclear power plant? Does it turn into a nuclear bomb? And I took the opportunity to sit down and draw some pictures about how nuclear power plants work and what nuclear bombs are. But to the general public, that's a reasonable question for a 17-year-old to ask. And so if you don't know anything about nuclear power, you default to the worst case. And so what I think is so important is just general education of the public. One of the projects in my previous company we were working on looking at new nuclear in Alaska. And we would go into a auditorium, a gym, whatever, and we'd sit down as people walked in, we had them, do you support a project? Do you not support a project? Yes or no? And
Hmm.
it would be, maybe 50-50, 60-40, whatever. By the time we got done talking and gave just a high level overview of what we were trying to do and why nuclear power is safe and what spent fuel is and how it can affect you and how it's managed, it was constantly, we'd increase the support by 20 to 30 to 40%. And that was after a half an hour or an hour of discussion. So getting out and talking to people, hearing what their concerns are, and having someone with the technical expertise to speak to them and explain to them. There's always going to be people who will say, okay, I understand, but I still don't like it. And that's okay, where there's nothing you're going to do about that. But getting people a base level of education of what is a nuclear power plant, what is nuclear fuel, what is spent fuel, what are these things that are talked about, and what is the impact to you? And everyone focuses on the negatives, but then also give an opportunity to tell about the positives. What is the average pay for a nuclear worker? It's pretty good. How long do these plants work for? What's the tax increase that the local community will get? There are a lot of positive benefits to the nuclear plant that people, going into it may not be aware of, and we shouldn't expect them to. So we have to be proactive to let people know what are the benefits of nuclear power.
I love that as an organization that has one of its important objectives, energy education. I think that's so important, and that the anecdote that you told about, moving the needle up in one session to get people to start thinking about it, that's fantastic. A question for you in terms of the international market. Have you guys done any studies on what the size of the market would look like, and who are competitors for the United States, and how does our process of developing a project differ, say, from our competitors, and what challenges do we face because perhaps our responsibility related to non-proliferation may be different than the way in which our competitors deal with that?
So just a couple of comments. That is a great question. So a couple of comments on competition. So I'd say from the United States perspective, the biggest competition is Russia and China. And you can look at what they're proposing to do. And for example, Russia is currently building a nuclear power plant in Turkey under a model called build, own, operate, where the Russians come in with all of the money and all of the everything you need to build the plant, and the Russians will own the plant and the Russians will operate the plant. And so, from the Turkish perspective, they did work some agreements in that they'll have as much local content as they can, but they are now beholden to Russia for the fuel supply, for the operations, for the maintenance, for everything. And so, for a country that is capital limited, having someone come in and say, you don't need to raise any capital, we'll do it for you. That is a real competition. The United States, there are many, you think of Exim Bank or any other sort of financing options out there. There are many, but none of them will come in with all the capital for you. So that's a big challenge. Russia is doing that now. China is poised to do that. They're already talking about that. So those are the big competition. Relative to the demand, we kind of look at it in phases. The first phases will be places that have typically legacy nuclear plants, or at least have some sort of nuclear experience. Um, and they have growing needs. For any number of the reasons we talked for, more electrical demand, more need for getting off of natural gas for climate or energy resilience, whatever it is. Um, and so we think about Eastern Europe as a key area there. Then we start looking at the fast growing areas of the world that have similar needs. So Southeast Asia is another big one. So we already talked about Philippines. You can list off, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, kind of looking at that part of the world, a lot of growth potential. And then the next wave after that is I'd say the more developing world, but as they go from lower per capita energy consumption to higher, they're going to need a lot of power. And in places where they don't have a natural resource that they can tap on, or like if they want to not use fossil fuels, so you look like in India, or if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you look at South America, these places are going to be in the next, this is, like I said, this is kind of third phase. This is looking out maybe 20, 30 years, but there's going to be huge potential for export of US nuclear technology. One of the challenges is going to be the supply chain. Some of these, and I worked for a reactor vendor myself. You look at the projections. Of, this one says, well, we're going to sell 500 units by 2035. When you start thinking about the supply chain, the people, the fuel, the metal vessels, all of the specialty, some of these reactors require special salts. So salt, think of table salt, but melted salts that need to be used for coolants. And then you have special valves that go along with those. There's a whole supply chain that needs to be developed. That's both a challenge but an opportunity. And so in these countries that are looking at building new nuclear, starting to develop that workforce, start developing that supply chain, those are going to be key aspects that are going to allow them to succeed. But then kind of going back to now, wrapping it all around, the geopolitics of nuclear power is a real factor. A nuclear power plant is a 60 to 100-year commitment. And so when we start talking with, well, let's go back to the Philippines because we're working closely with them in the United States and Philippines are close partners. That is a great partnership for both countries. And so as we look at establishing this partnership and working with them across a 60 to 100-year timeline, what does that look like? So then let's switch gears and talk about Africa for a little bit. There's a lot of Chinese and Russian influence. And what are they promising? What can they get from the Chinese? What can they get from Russians? What can they get from the US? And how does all of that play? So it's a very complex landscape. It's unfortunately a lot harder than us engineers like to think it's going to be. It's not just who can get the pipes and the poles, but it's really a lot of intergovernment relations as well.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, having worked in the industry overseas for many, many years. And, I want to follow up on one of the points you made just at the end there, which is, you factor in a country like Russia that does a build, own, operate model largely through grant funding. And then you look at the complicated financial arrangements that an American investor would have to make to build the same plant, even if it was a smaller version like an SMR. What resources does the U.S. government offer to a developer who may be looking overseas to sort of buy down some of the risk and the financial cost to compete with our strategic competitors like Russia and China?
Yeah, so the U.S. government um, kind of has a phased approach. So there is, if you kind of start from the very early stages, like when I was talking about from the NEPU stage to developing the regulator and the owner operator to actual deployment. So the NEPU stage, the Department of State has grants and funding to work with entities to help them get through those first steps of start thinking about how are we going to organize, how are we going to pick our sites, what kind of technology are we going to pick. And then from there, there's a handoff. It's not maybe a clear handoff, but the next step is the US TDA. And now that's getting you to that next step of, okay, we have we figured out our regulator, we figured out who's going to be our operator. Now let's start getting down to the real nuts and bolts of where are we going to build this thing? Who's going to build it? How are we going to do the stakeholder engagement? And then the next step is after TDA is the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. That's an entity that is actively taking, either equity or debt or, combinations thereof in projects to help support projects that can go forward. There's the Exim Bank as well that can play a big role. The World Bank recently came out and came in support of nuclear projects. The Asia Development Bank made a similar announcement in November. So there's a lot of these external finance paths that are available that are rapidly warming to nuclear power. And again, it comes back to what we talked about at the beginning. It's the carbon-free nature. it's the energy resilience, it's the stability. A lot of these new demands, call it data centers or any other sort of large electrical load, likes to be on all the time. It can't follow the wind as it comes and goes. And while renewables play a great role in the grid development, renewables and batteries can do a lot. If you have demand that needs to be on all the time, you can't just rely on renewables and batteries.
Great. Well, Dan, I think we're about at our 30-minute timeline here. And so I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you for the good work that Excel Services Corporation does here domestically and internationally to bring this low carbon source of dependable energy to a globe that badly needs more energy to solve its problems. Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to our future stakeholder podcasts. And thanks to the audience.
Great. Thanks, Will. I really appreciate the time today.